The metal of my power sword tasted like cold prayer and old iron. The chapel candles smelled of wax and something I would never name aloud. I had wanted to be chosen. I had stood in the market beneath the choir of bells and watched sisters pass on their way to stations of judgment and mercy. They carried themselves like absolution. I wanted that steadiness. What I did not know then was how much of me would be counted, priced, and taken to forge that choice into a weapon. They measured faith as if it were a thing with weight. A matron from the ecclesiarchy set a palm to my forehead, her fingers cooler than the damp morning. She read me a list of debts I had not known I owed. Childhood sins, the name of a father who drank too long, a sister who married poorly. Each confession was a coin she placed in a bowl made of brass and scripture. When she spoke of the Adepta Sororitas, she spoke low as if the words themselves might startle God. Service, she said, penance, protection. I echoed them because echoing is safe. Training was never gentle. The drills began before dawn, when the chapel was still a hollow place of shadows and gutters. We ran until our boots sang against stone, until our lungs learned to bargain with pain. The instructors, women with knotted hair and eyes like flint, moved among us like storm fronts. They corrected how we held our breath, how we set our jaw. We learned to make silence into armor. They taught us to feel the weight of a bolter as if it were an extension of our bone, to let a power sword settle into the palm like a promise. The first time the blade hummed under my hand, a sound like a church bell being struck inside my chest. Something in me unclenched and then tightened in a different place. There were rites that were not spoken of to novices, gestures and little violences that belonged to the adults. They shaved our heads in a room that smelled of steam and soap and something antiseptic. I had imagined a single baldness would be a relief, a shedding. But it was also a spectacle of nakedness before law. The matron who did it smiled in a way that made her eyes thin. She told me to stand tall and repeat the creed. I said the words until my tongue knew them better than my own name. Names, too, were measured. My family name was listed with other liabilities. There was a ledger for that, kept by someone with ink-stained fingers. I signed it because signing felt like stepping over an invisible line. At night, we sat in the gallery and listened to hymns that rose like smoke. The lyrics made pictures in my head: ash, iron, a throne of light. One sister, older than the rest, played a stringed thing that made the stones remember the first prayers. Her hands were steady despite everything the world had put into them. She hummed a tone that seemed to stitch my nerves into a seam. I realized then that becoming a sister was not only a surrender of blood and name, it was a slow grafting of someone else's certainty into your spine. You traded indecision for a pattern, and in that pattern you found purpose, or else you were eaten by it. We were examined too in ways that were clinical and intimate. A priest with a voice like a ledger spoke of bloodlines and lineages, of purity and the empire's law. He did not look at my face while he checked my pulse and my reaction to cold iron. Instruments were pressed to my skin. The sensation was clinical, devoid of melodrama. Later, in the quiet of a cell, I understood the cost. There were marks left by the examination, small, codified, so that no other hand could claim the girl I had been. They told me it was for my protection. I told myself I believed it. Comradeship grew in the spaces between drills. We ate from the same tin plates, washed under the same cold shower spouts, and traded stories that were both prayer and weapon. Sister Katya laughed like breaking glass. She had a habit of folding her hands the exact way a veteran priest folded his scriptures. Sister Mara had a scar across her cheek that traced a half-smile in memory. We learned each other's breathing. In the heat of training, one of us would falter and another would hold her up without asking. That support was not sentimental. It was pragmatic. A squad cannot carry a weight if one of its members cracks. Still, when I lay awake at night, the thought of these women kept the hollow place inside me from widening into a chasm. There were private moments where doubt slipped through like rain through a bad roof. Once, in a latrine between drills, I watched steam curl from my palms and wondered what I had really traded. My mother had written a letter before they took me away. The matron had read it aloud and folded it into the files. It spoke of bread, of prayers, of fear. It had ended with a single crooked blessing. They allowed me to keep nothing of it but a small scrap. For months, I thought of that scrap as contraband treasure. Later, I learned to think of it as an artifact from a life now catalogued. The memory of my mother's hands folding bread was something I could no longer return to without being watched. The chapel rituals were the heaviest. On the day of my oath, the light came through stained glass and turned the altar into a field of bruised color. The canoness who oversaw us moved like a ship in still water, grand and inevitable. She recited the oaths with a voice that made the stone listen. We placed our hands on the scripture, felt the hum of the relic beneath the cloth. The ceremony was layered with small acts. A cross traced across the brow, the pressing of a seal into our palm. I tasted wax on the air and copper at the back of my throat. The vows themselves were simple and exacting: to serve, to protect, to never yield. When I spoke them, my voice did not shake. The cost arrived later, not as a single blow, but as a series of quiet extractions. There were practical extractions, time taken, bone and muscle sharpened into function. There were also the smaller amputations, charts of fertility, permissions withheld, letters sent to the family that declared a new legal status. Your body became a ledger of obligations. You were cataloged into usefulness, your days broken into service and rest. I learned to think like a ledger too. Every warmth I wanted was balanced by an instruction. Every lapse of feeling met by a reprimand. You get good at embracing the form the order gives you. That is how you survive. That is also how the order survives. The line between survival and surrender thinned until you could scarcely tell when you crossed it. Night patrols came next, not as schooling but as initiation. We walked corridors where the air tasted of old iron and machine oil, where the lights hummed and the shadows seemed to lean. The first time a heretic was reported, we moved as one body. There was no joy in it, only an efficiency honed to solve a problem. When the call came, it was sharp, a bell, a coded intonation. We shouldered our arms and stepped into the dark, our breath synchronized like metronomes. I remember the way my boots sounded, a clean percussion on stone. I remember the quiet prayer I mouthed under my breath, not for victory, but for the steadiness to do what would be required. Occasionally a sister failed. Failure was not punished with spectacle, but with a kind of clinical removal. Reassignment, a quiet demotion, a sent-back letter. The order did not relish drama. It repaired what it could and recorded the rest for the archives. When one of our number was taken away, we folded their space into silence and carried on. That silence was its own teaching. It told us what would happen to any of us who let doubt root. It taught us to replace doubt with ritual, and ritual with action. On the evening before my final blessing, I held the power sword again. It was heavier than memory, heavy with latency and expectation. The chapel lights had been trimmed low. The matron who had once measured my sins now adjusted the sword's pommel, her hands sure and unhesitating. She looked at me as if I were a book she had read and marked up. "You know what it costs," she said. Her voice was neither cruel nor kind, it was simply factual. I thought of my mother's scrap of paper folded like a secret, of Sister Katya's laugh, of the canoness ship's silent certainty, and of the ledger that had become my new name. I thought of the blade's hum settling into my palm like a second heart. I raised the sword an inch and did not let it tremble. Ahead of me lay the oaths, the light, the first mission where those oaths would be tested. I stepped forward because stepping back was no longer possible, and because something inside me, small, stubborn, wanted to know what I might become if I kept walking. The wax candle guttered as if the air itself were listening. I opened my eyes to a ceiling of stone ribs and the echo of 100 voices chanting my new name. And for a moment I thought the world had become a cathedral dome folded around my ribs. Someone, a sister whose face I had only ever seen in quick glances, laid a cold coin on my tongue and told me to taste iron and vow it. The metal was like smoke and memory, like the coin my mother used to hide in my palm when markets were crowded and smiles were scarce. I swallowed and felt the taste of both things at once. Salt, memory, obligation. They bound my hands with the same cords they had used on a dozen other novices that season. The rope smelled of prayer and old wine. It tightened until breathing was a conscious act, a decision. Canoness Marceline stood above me. Her voice did not rise, it pressed. She spoke the injunctions. I repeated them not because my throat obeyed, but because my mouth had been trained to form the syllables. Each phrase slid into place like a ring on bone. I learned then how obedience could be given mechanically, how one could speak vows and leave something like a ledger entry where a heart used to be. The first light came through the narrow slit of the chapel window, a blade of morning that found the cutting edge of my collarbone. They placed a rosarius against my breast, a small silver reliquary filled with blessed text and a sliver of the Emperor's light, or so the sister said. And I felt a warmth like a hand cupped over a small, stubborn ember. It was the sort of thing that made you certain for an instant that everything was as it should be. That certainty, I would learn, was the most expensive possession I would ever be asked to sell. Training began by swallowing smoke and the taste of prayer until both burned away. The drills were a language rhythm kept meaning safe from doubt. We learned to make our faith a reflex. We learned to fold it into gestures, a sign over the heart, a sigil drawn in the dust, until even fear translated into liturgy. The bolter felt heavy and sacred in my hands. Not because the metal demanded reverence, but because our elders had taught us to call it by names that made the act of killing sound like sacrament. I never thought of my hands as instruments of absolution until they were locked around triggers that required yes or no, and offered only the cold, final weight of consequence. There was a price for that economy of certainty. They took the small, private things first. Tokens from home were burned in a brass brazier while we chanted the litany of purging. I watched the paper curl and blacken and felt something in me go with it, an ache more specific than grief. It named itself later, the right to keep a secret, to hold a memory untold. In its place they set an acceptable grief, circumscribed and useful. Sorrow for the emperor's distant wars, anger at false faiths, a righteous mourning that could be redirected into fervor. It was neat, efficient work, the bureaucratic kind of cruelty that rearranges a soul and calls the result devotion. Not all costs were admitted in ceremony. Some lived in small bureaucratic sentences tucked into charters and oaths. You renounce all kinship, not necessary to the mission, the line in my vows said, as if blood were a negotiable commodity. They called the renunciation a liberation. The wardens who taught us told stories of sisters freed from the chains of family to serve the greater good. But the ledger entry was a blade. Letters from my sister arrived at the convent and were opened by the sisters of the penitent. Names were removed, phrases amended, and the paper folded again with a note, delivered as counsel for your strength. I read my sister's words with a kind of practiced calm. I learned to correct their grammar in my mind, to translate affection into lesson. It was a small erasure, but erasures pile, they become a geography where you cannot find the road you once walked. There were other, more intimate alterations. They removed my hair in a ritual that smelled of hot oil and cold metal. The shears came with a prayer. The sisters trimmed my curls with the tenderness of a surgeon and the finality of a judge. Someone wrapped the cut strands in the red cloth kept for memorials and said the words that made the act holy. I felt exposed, then girded. The mirror in the novice's dormitorium showed me a face framed by a kerchief and a new name. It did not feel like mine, and that absence felt like room enough to store other people's expectations. It was a practical thing. Hair could catch fire in close quarters, they said, but also a symbol that the self is something that could be reshaped in a single stroke. Faith, too, was a weapon fashioned out of lack. We were taught to cultivate righteous fury as if it were a field to harvest. The sisters drilled us in the language of heresy, and the vocabulary simplified what should have been complex. Heretic, apostate, corrupted. Words that once meant nuance now became coordinates for action. You could point them at a person and open a map that did not include shelter. During liturgies at dusk, when candle flames moved like tiny ships, I would watch a sister named Isolde, quick-faced, precise, recite the names of heretics they'd condemned, and I noticed something in her wrist, a tremor that only showed when the lights were low. She carried the cost where no ledger could touch it, memory that refused the name cleansed. The confessions were the most dangerous thing. We knelt in dim rooms and whispered things that were allowed into a kind of holy archive, things that would be used to burn or to bind. The confessor's pen was not merciful. It translated doubt into a case file. It was then that I first understood the institutional appetite for sin as a thing to manage. You did not confess to be forgiven so much as to be categorized. And once classified, you were easier to steer. There are choices that stop being yours before your hands know they have been placed on the plow. Perhaps the heaviest cost was to choice itself. The oath spoke of obedience as liberation. They told us that to lay down personal will was to be made holy. But obedience is a hinge. It allows movement, yes, but it also locks doors. Once I had sworn to obey, my life started to move on rails I could not see. Orders came like weather. Sometimes they were rain that cleansed a field. Sometimes they raised floods. One day I was ordered to escort a convoy of relics across a sector with a reputation for banditry. The women under my command looked to me for decisions I had not yet been taught how to make. The manuals gave tactics and doctrine, but not the small mercies that matter in the heat of a roadside ambush. We were taught to cast doubt away, but doubt is stubborn as rust. In the quiet between drills, I found myself thinking of the coin in my mouth, of my sister's handwriting, of the face in the mirror that still startled me. Sometimes it came as a physical ache, like hunger. Other times it was like a song on the edge of hearing. I began to keep a small, illicit habit, a prayer for things without a sanctioned name. It was not a rebellion in the grand sense. It was a way to keep a piece of later for myself. If they caught it, I knew the consequences: penance and reordering of duties, perhaps reassignment. But I was no longer sure whether the worst punishment would be exile from the order or the loss of that tiny sovereign thought. The sisters who had been here longer carried a different kind of cost. One evening I watched Sister Oriel fold a map in the dim light and trace a route with a finger that had the steady, practiced motion of someone accustomed to danger. "You will learn to love the cause," she said without looking up. Her voice had the lilt of someone who had reconciled a lot. "Love carries a hunger," I replied, testing my honesty. She smiled thinly. "Then feed it the right meat, child." She had not told me what she fed hers. I suspected it was memory and the absence of it. What they do not tell you about taking an oath is how it redraws the borders of your loneliness. In the barracks at night, when others slept and the candles burned low, I felt the presence of the sisters, close as cloth but not warmth. We were surrounded by a sisterhood, and yet solitude advanced like frost, edging into the corners the communal heat could not reach. Even as we learned to move together in drills and liturgy, I grew aware that the inner life of a sister is a private battlefield. You could be intimate with someone's stride and not know the shape of their sorrow. Training finishes in stages and then in a single unsparing test. We were told the day would come when first light would be literal and not metaphorical. That we would feel our faith turn from a warm ember to a flame that could be seen at a distance. Some of us spoke of that day with bright eyes. Others wore it like a weight they did not wish to lift. For me, the test would be leading my first patrol across a ruined estatescape where rumor said a small cult had holed up beneath collapsed viaducts. The mission briefs were stark and bureaucratic. They measured risk and spoke of objectives. Canoness Marceline signed the orders herself and set my name at the head. I felt the gavel of responsibility drop across my sternum. Standing in the armory while sisters moved around me like a choir of armed instruments, I tried on relic armor. The pauldron fit like a promise. Under the metal, I could feel my pulse, each beat a staccato refutation of the calm I had practiced in the chapel. The cost had already been levied. My private lines had been rerouted into public service. I fastened the seals that marked my rank. Each little parchment clinked against iron. A sister next to me checked the cartridges of her flamer and gave me a nod. "The first light will find you," she said. Her voice was a promise and a warning. I do not know yet whether I will answer that light with a clean heart or with a pocket full of contraband memories. I walked out of the armory with the weight of both the rosarius and the coin that had once belonged to my mother, folded into the lining of my cloak where no one would think to look. My hands knew how to steady a bolter. My throat knew how to sing the litanies when fear struck. The question that pressed against the back of my teeth was simpler and far older than doctrine. Could a woman who had learned to translate love into purpose also keep a secret small enough to be hers alone? Ahead of me, the streets waited. Collapsed arches, alleys like wounds, the thin light of a dawn that promised exposure. I tightened my grip on the reliquary, tasted the metal of the rosarius with the back of my tongue, and set my face to the new sun, ready to move into what I had sworn to become and to find out what price that would require in the dark. They forced me to kneel on cold flagstones while candles guttered like tired sentinels. The chapel smelled of oil and iron and the dry powder of incense that stuck to my throat. Around me, the sisters were a forest of dark habits and plate, faces half hidden by veils and the square, unyielding planes of power armor. A brass gong struck once, twice the sound crawled through my bones and seemed to set my heart to its slow, solemn rhythm. I did not know if I was listening to the bell or to my own pulse. A hand, firm, calloused, took mine and fitted something cold and thin against my palm. It was an iron ring scoured to a dull shine, engraved with a name not yet mine and the sigil of our order. The metal tasted of dust when I brought it to my mouth to kiss it, because that is what they taught us to do in the barracks. Kiss iron, kiss scripture, kiss the sign of your oath. I felt the ring like a promise and a weight at once. The canoness spoke the words. Her voice was close as a blade, to give everything, to surrender all her worldly ties, to be the emperor's hammer and the ecclesiarchy's will. The lines were litany and law, spoken slow so that every vowel had time to find a place in my chest. They asked for the obvious things: service, obedience, chastity. But the phrasing folded into itself and made new demands. A life rendered blunt to a purpose, a memory pared down to sharpened edges that fit a uniform. I thought of the house where I had grown up. The memory surprised me like a bruise, sudden, unwelcome, bright with recollection. My father's laugh in the heat of summer, the cracked basin where my mother washed our few dishes, the way the sun lay across the threshold at noon. Those images trembled on the edge of my mind, fragile as dust motes. An older sister beside me may have seen the motion of my lips. She squeezed my fingers hard enough to hurt. That small pain grounded me. It tethered me to the present and kept me from letting my past fold inward and vanish on its own. They made us promise in pieces. Each obligation was a notch on the ring, another syllable in a longer sentence that would swallow all other sentences. You pledged obedience, and then you pledged the deadweight serenity that obedience demanded. You pledged to be celibate, but what they really meant was to be impermeable. No longing that might split you, no secret that could be used by the enemy, no tenderness that the machine of war could seize. They smoothed us into shapes that could be hammered, and the hammer was faith. The iron ring closed with a cold sound that was almost a click and then very nearly silence. There was a formal signing, ink, shaken hands, a name written and then repeated until it felt like it belonged to the letters themselves. They gave me a new name that was shorter and harder to keep because names with too many syllables gather into stories. The canoness did not ask whether I would miss my old one. She did not need to. In that place, forgetting was an act of sanctity. After the sealing, we were led to the armory. The room smelled of oiled leather and the tang of ozone from stored energy cells. Racks of weapons hung like a congregation bolters with their distant, comforting weight. Blades that sang when you tilted them beneath the light. A sister with a bronze scar across her cheek fitted a rosarius around my neck. The amulet was warm against my skin, humming faintly like trapped lightning. It was both charm and anchor. It would be my protection and my reminder that protection must be earned through devoutness and sacrifice. They fitted me with plate for the first time. I'd trained with padded jerkin and rifle, but metal is a grammar of its own. The carapace straps bit into my shoulders, the helmet's visor lowered over my face with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounded like a closing jaw. The first time you feel the carapace settle, you understand how armor remakes a body into a weapon. Breath becomes smaller inside the shell. Movement becomes more deliberate. Your hand no longer moves for you, it moves because you have willed it to. I felt both fortified and confined, protected and boxed in. Training had taught us to treat these sensations as neutral facts, like wind or weather. But sensations lodge, and over weeks and months they built a landscape inside me. The pressure at the base of the skull when someone spoke of mercy. The hollow warmth around my ribs when I saw a child survive. The sour, sharp scent of fear in my throat that would not leave. Faith in the order was a muscle and also a contagion. You exercised it until the rest of yourself atrophied, until you began to measure everything by how useful it would be in the next engagement. Then came the first light itself, the test I had been circling since I arrived. It was framed as demonstration and blessing. We were not merely to march beneath the gaze of reliquaries, we would be the reliquary. There are moments that are carved of clarity where the world seems to peel and you see the mechanism behind it. I stepped into the yard where the morning leaned like a blade against the horizon. Sun caught the dust in the air and set it sparkling like something alive. They told us that faith could be given form. You invoke it with voice and gesture and concentration, and sometimes, the Emperor answers. I had watched other sisters perform small miracles. A babe who had stopped breathing drew a long, ragged shudder and began again. A barracks furnace that had failed burst back to heat. It looked less like magic and more like fit. The sisters called it an act of faith, a concentrated will, a channeling of belief into deed. When it worked, The world aligned with your intent as if obeying a law of physics. They left me alone to try. The yard was ringed by sisters who were both my audience and my jury. My mouth-shaped prayers I had learned at 5 and at 15 and at 21 until they layered and multiplied. The rosarius lay hot against my sternum like a lamp. I could hear my pulse in the chain around my throat. At first nothing happened. The sun rose and nothing answered. My voice shook and my hands trembled. Doubt is an animal that smells weakness and will take residence quickly. I felt it settling, a small, persistent cold. I thought of my father's laugh in the basin again. I thought absurdly of a pot left on the coals. I thought of all the soft, private things that had no place in a life of iron. Then something shifted. It was not spectacle. It did not burn 2 sisters and raise the dead. It was smaller, like the easing of a knot in a rope. The rosarius warmed, and the warmth flowed through the chain into my hands. My breathing evened, and a clarity arrived with it, an exactness like the smell of rain that tells you which way the wind will turn. I felt certain of one thing. I could carry weight. I could take pain and hold it steady. I could move with intentionality toward an aim. The sisters who watched did not exhale out loud, but their shoulders loosened as if they had been holding their breath in solidarity and were now allowed to breathe individually. The canoness inclined her head only once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It felt like approval and like a verdict. I did not know which it was. The hidden cost, when it unfurled, did not show itself in pyrotechnia or immediate sacrifice. It came like a shadow across a window once the sun had moved. In the days that followed, I noticed I could not remember certain things as clearly. The texture of my mother's hands was a blur. The laugh of a friend bent into an outline. The more I invoked that bright, practiced certainty, the acts of faith, the prayers, the giving, the thinner some memories became, as if my mind had to make room for the ritual by sweeping out small, unnecessary corners. There was something else too, an instinct that had been mine, small and protective and often useless in war, softened until it was almost gone. When I passed a beggar in the hive, my heart no longer lurched at the sight of gaunt arms. When a child clung to a woman's skirt and begged for bread, I did not stop. The logic of my new life was efficient and frighteningly clean. You saved those you could save in numbers and causes, not an anecdote. Mercy became a category applied with calculations rather than the warmth that wells up without asking permission. Sometimes late at night, when the barracks were a low hum, I would wake with my hands clenched and a memory half-etched behind my eyes. I would reach for it and it would slide away like oil, or a name spoken by someone whose lips were moving underwater. I began to understand why the order prized uniformity and silence. The more that was erased, the less a sister could be taken apart. A sister without unnecessary knots was harder to break. They would tell you that this was the purity of purpose. A hammer does not feel pain, it transfers force. They would quote scripture about sacrifice and the greater good. None of that made it easier to let the small things die. If there is a private cost to being remade, it is that your life grows narrower in order to be steadier, and in narrowing you lose the textures that once made you human beyond the function you serve. But narrowing also brings focus. The first time I fired a bolter under true command, my aim found what it was meant to hit, like a hand finding a familiar notch. The world of sensations contracted to useful data, the wind, the weight, the rhythm of enemy steps. In that precision was power. In that power was the kind of peace that arrives after exhaustion. The quiet that follows a long, productive work. I tasted the paradox, relief braided with loss. I had been remade to be an instrument of the Emperor's will. That remaking demanded quiet amputations of self. Whether those losses were worth the purpose would have to be decided later, in the counting of lives saved and the tally of deeds done. For now, my decision was immediate. Dawn would come again in a few hours. The order had no patience for hesitation. I stood at the edge of the brigades, mustering ground with the rosarius cold against my chest and the iron ring dimly warm on my finger. The canoness stared down the line, measuring, calculating. She was both a blade and a compass. She did not speak. Her silence said more than any sermon. I breathed in the new air, a mixture of diesel smoke and baking dust and the thin metallic tang that always arrived before combat. And for the first time since the ring had been placed on my finger, I felt the oath settle into me not as a constraint but as a lever. I could lift things now. I could bear weight. Behind that lever, though, something would always be missing. I tightened my grip on my bolter. The sun scraped the horizon and edged the world with light. I stepped forward. The chapel smelled of metal and beeswax. Candles lined the nave like a line of pale teeth, each flame a small accusation. I pressed my palm to the black reliquary because the canoness said to do so, and because hands need ballast when the world shifts underfoot. The cold of the relic ate through my glove and sat under my skin like a promise. Around me, sisters drew breath as if the air itself were prayer, and the sound braided with the organ until it became something you could taste. They led us one by one to the stone of iron oaths. My knees remembered the way the pavement bit the first time I knelt, the way the cold settled like a second thought. The confessor's voice was sand and river stones. She spoke the words that would unmake and remake me. The syllables were old, worn into grooves by thousands of tongues, and when I repeated them, my voice felt both thin and enormous, like glass stretched over a furnace. Each clause closed another seam of my past. Names slipped from my memory like unlit candles blown out by a draft I could not feel. There is a small, private terror in losing the people you love to history. It is not sudden. It is a gradual erasure, a paper soaked in rain until the ink runs and becomes pattern rather than story. I tried to hold one memory, my sister's laugh, a hot bread crust, the way our mother tied hair, like a coin between my teeth. The rituals made that coin taste of ash. When the canoness spoke of duty and purity, I felt something fold behind my ribs. It was almost relief. That surprised me more than any ache. The first light came not as a herald, but as a physical thing. They call it that because you cannot name what sears the inside of your skull when someone takes your name and makes you theirs. It began as a pressure along my spine, a faint prickle like static, then a deeper pull as if tendons were being stitched to new vows. Someone placed the ceramite breastplate on my chest. The metal was warm from the forge, and the smell of burning oil threaded through the incense. When the armor closed around me, it did not simply sit, it settled into me, aligning, humming against my sternum like a promise answered. They read out the oaths aloud. I did not hear all the words. The chapel's acoustics took some, the canoness took others, and the rest the machinery swallowed. But I understood the shape. Loyalty without room for return, obedience that wrapped itself around your throat, zeal sharpened until it could cut necessity into absolutes. The priest placed the rosarius, the small loop of blessed iron and chain, in my hand. It was wait and answer both. I held it like a vow and understood how easily that weight could become an anchor. Before the brand, because the rite was not only spiritual, there were tests, simple things practiced 1,000 times until muscle spoke before thought. The bolter felt like a living thing in my hands, a contradiction of bone and machine. Its barrel smelled of oil and women who had fired it before me. I moved through the drill room in a choreography of repetition. Mount, aim, breathe, release. Each motion closed a gap that the mind might otherwise wander into. When my head tried to go to my old life, an orchard, a laugh, a street vendor's curse, the rhythm of the weapon brought it back. Rituals are scaffolding for the soul as much as for the body. They tested our resolve with hunger and with cold. Fasting is a lens. Under dull light, your thoughts sharpen. Under knife-slate hunger, you meet your own edges. I had thought I understood deprivation. There was nothing in my old life that taught me how to fold an absence into obedience the way a sister learns to fold hunger into praise. You learn to want the right thing with a deliberate, practiced hunger. It makes you very dangerous to those who rely on desire. When they brought the brand, they did so with ceremony and with hands that did not tremble. The instrument was simple metal, clean, white-hot, a line to be made permanent. The pain was not a single moment. It spread and settled and taught me a new vocabulary for sensation. But pain without context is only torment. Pain with meaning becomes a story. The canonist spoke of sacrifice and protection and the emperor's gaze. The flames in the brazier made the chapel's colors swim, and the sisters around me took on the soft blur of saints in frescoes. I closed my eyes and counted the syllables of the oath until the brand felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had written in someone else's ink. What they did not tell you in the catechisms is how the mind reorders itself around new structures. Memory is not only what you keep, but what you choose to file away. In the quiet hours, when the chapel's candles gutters and the world outside is a rumor of boots on stone, my thoughts would climb to an attic in my head I thought I had sealed. Sometimes a laugh would slip in, or a child's shout, and it felt indecent. The way you might smell bread in a cathedral and feel shame that your stomach remembers something the altar does not. That shame is a lever. It opens doors. We were given new names, neat and liturgical, names that fit on hymnals and carved into the relays of power armor. Names are both gift and erasure. When the steward fitted my pauldrons and the servos clicked awake, it was like hearing my name said back to me in a voice that belonged to the order. There is comfort in the symmetry, there is danger too. A name can be a chain bright as a relic. It can anchor you, and it can bind you so tightly you cannot move when the world tilts. Camaraderie came like a slow tide. You cannot endure so many cold nights and iron mornings without leaning into each other. A sister would braid another's hair with motions that had nothing to do with vanity. We shared scraps of bread and stories so small they seemed to be lit from the inside. Jokes about training, about a chaplain's odd tic, the way a veteran hummed certain hymns when angry. Those tiny intimacies were contraband in some lectures and salvation in others. When the lights dimmed and the outer doors were sealed, the bunk room hummed with whispered names and quiet rituals no canonist could catalog. We were, for a few stolen hours, less marble and more human. Yet the hidden costs kept accruing, quiet and occult. Every choice we made became a calculation in absolutes. Mercy cost you vigilance, mercy cost you the possibility of survival. You learned to weigh a child's life against a mission's outcome with a geometry that made you dizzy. There is a cruelty in clarity. When your world insists that anything wasted is heresy, your hands learn cold economy. You sharpen the calculus until you can cut the hesitation out of an operator's face. We trained for war, yes, but more than skill, they trained our moral sight. They pointed us toward black and white because nuance eats commanders. It is easier to march an army when each man sees the enemy as an absence rather than a person. That easing of vision saves lives in small campaigns and costs others in ways that curl under your skin like creeping moss. I began to notice it in myself. An impatient pruning of doubt, a quick softening when a target's humanity emerged. The canonists would call that clarity. Sometimes I wondered which name fit the thing better. The shrine's bells tolled the final hour before our first deployment. The sound rolled through the corridors and set the armor plates vibrating like a chorus. I strapped my rosarius back on and felt the chain against my breastplate. The ritual had done its work. I could feel the oath sitting like ballast in my chest, heavy and precisely placed. There it was, the cost and the currency both. I had surrendered a private geography of memory and feeling and received in return a single map everyone else recognized. It was not an equal trade, and I knew it. As we walked through the arched doors, the corridor emptied into sunlight that looked wrong against the cathedral stone. The light outside was not blessed, it was plain and indiscriminate. It washed the brothers in arms and the novices alike, wiping away the chapel's vellum softness and leaving the world in its true harsh colors. A servitor clanked past with crates marked for frontline aid. Somewhere a trumpeter warmed his lips, someone else swore under their breath at a stuck bolt on a pack. The day smelled of oil and distant ozone, not incense. It was an arrival as much as a departure. Found my place in the column and felt the armor's weight in a way that no sermon could have taught me. The sisters beside me adjusted straps, checked magazines, and assumed faces like masks of prayer. My name felt solid on my tongue now, a stone I could rub with my thumb to remember where to stand. We moved out beneath the sun, and every step made the oaths hum at the edges of thought. I had all the right answers when the chaplain asked if we were ready. I meant them, but something lingered, a small unfastened thing at the back of my neck. It was not regret in the storybook sense, it was a little astonishment that the world beyond the cathedral still kept its own light source. I had been granted certainty, discipline, and purpose. Those things were armor for the soul. They would keep me alive. They would also make me less able to see the hues between salvation and damnation. A cry went up as the skirl of the Vox announced our shuttle. It was not a battle cry. It was a sound of movement, of engines and orders and the larger machinery of the Imperium taking us in its grasp. We stepped into the belly of the transport and were strapped down. The interior smelled of metal and a faint, persistent tang of sanctified oil. My fingers found the rosarius under my breastplate, and I curled around its coolness the way a sleeper clutches a dream. The weight of the vow was a comfort and a chain, a simple thing both absolute and complex. As the ramp closed and the engines began to build, I thought of the attic in my head and the unlit candles still tucked away there. I did not know if I would ever find the time or the safe ground to pry them out again. The iron oaths had given me focus. They had also made certain rooms inaccessible, locked with keys I no longer possessed. That knowledge felt like an old wound, raw, reflective, and secretly useful. We rose into a sky that looked like steel turned to blue by some impatient god. The cathedral fell away until it was a small scar on the land. Ahead, the Vox chatter, sharpened orders came down like rain. The captain's voice was thin but steady. I tightened the straps and thought of the canonized words the confessor had pressed into my mouth. They were true so far as I could see. They demanded more than I had imagined giving. I had given it, piece by careful piece. The transport shuddered as it broke atmosphere. My heart matched the tempo of the engines, anxious, purposeful, inevitable. I tasted the metallic tang again and realized then that I had already begun to trade parts of myself for the order. The trade had changed me, yes, but it also made me useful in ways my old life never could have. Usefulness is a kind of mercy in war. We would disembark in an hour. The bells of the chapel would be a memory, the brand a private map, the rosarius a weight against my sternum. Ahead of us lay a landscape that required decisions that could not be undone by hymn or confession. I tightened my grip and breathed, letting the armor settle. The oath thrummed like a second pulse under my ribs. I stepped toward the hatch as the transport's voice spoke into the cabin. The order short and certain. My mouth had learned the rhythm of obedience. I stepped forward because orders were the spine of our purpose and because, for all the costs laid like stones at my feet, I had chosen this road. The hatch opened into light and cold and the distant rumble of a world that would not wait for our sanctity. I pulled my rosarius close and felt the ring of iron against my palm, small, hard, and exact. We were going to do what we were made to do. The cost was clear now. It had teeth and reasons and a shape I could recognize. I moved through the ramp and into the air, and whatever lay beyond waited for response.